Hey everyone, Nick Manning here, and today I'm going to show you how to install the Postgres database on Windows, Mac, and Linux. So Postgres is a SQL database that's very, very popular. And when we write apps, full stack Flutter apps with Flutter on the front end and the Aqueduct framework on the back end using Dart, we're going to integrate with a Postgres database. That Postgres database is going to run locally, or it can run in the cloud somewhere, and I will show you how to do that in another video, how to set up that database in the cloud. So for now, we're going to just install it locally and just set it up and cover the basics. So with that, let's get started. Okay, so let's install Postgres on Windows, and then I'll go to Mac and Linux after that. So I'm at google.com right now. I'm going to just Google Postgres download, right? And when I Google Postgres download, you'll see something in the first hit here. We have Windows installers, macOS packages, etc. I'm going to click Windows installers. And this page isn't super user-friendly. It just shows you the different versions that are available. But the one that's the kind of like at the moment that's the most popular is Postgres version 12. A lot of people use 11 as well. It's important to have the same version that you're running locally as the version that you're going to be using when you deploy your code, the backend code, and the database into the cloud. Because if there's a weird problem, you want to make sure that the same version is used and the same features are used. But either way, I'm going to download this interactive installer. There's a link here called Download the Installer. It's up here on my mouse, where my mouse is floating at. And then I'm going to choose the operating system, Windows x86 64. So I have a modern operating system. It's 64-bit. And I'm going to use version 12.4. 13 is a bit new as of 2020. So let me just use version 12. I'm going to hit the download button. It's going to download. Okay, so now that it's downloaded, I'm going to double click the file that I downloaded here on the bottom left from my browser. I'm going to say yes to the permissions to allow it to install. It's going to boot up the installer here. Let me minimize my window, and the installer will run. Just give it a sec. So here's the installer. I'm going to hit next, next, and then heck, I'll install everything. The command line tools, it's going to install the server. It's going to install something called pgadmin4, which is a browser-based management tool. So you can run queries in your database. You can look at all the tables in your database, all that stuff. Stack Builder, I don't know what that is. I don't use it ever. I'm going to hit next. And then I'm going to type in a default password for my database. And the default password, because it's local, you don't have to set up multiple users for your database. You could just use one password for the main admin user. And that user is going to be called Postgres. This is important to note because when you're configuring your backend application, it needs to know what user and password it's going to connect with. So for the user is going to be Postgres. That's basically for any operating system. That's the default user it uses, Postgres. And the password is pretty important. I just keep it a simple password because there's no sensitive data on my computer. If there's very sensitive data on my computer, I'm going to use a stronger password. Right now, I'll just type like 1234. It's not a big deal for me. And I'm going to hit next. The port it typically runs on is 5432, so don't touch that. That's a very standard port with Postgres, and the port is something we use to connect to our database. That's all. It's a setting that we're going to need to use. And then locale, hit next, and then hit next, next, and then it's going to install. Okay, so the final part of the installation, it's going to start the server. And your server will, run every time you boot up your computer, so you don't have to worry about running it manually. Setup is finished. Launch Stack Builder. No, I'm just gonna uncheck that and hit finish. So how do I use Postgres? Make sure it's set up properly. I'm going to go to my start menu and type in Postgres. pgadmin, sorry. pgadmin. And pgadmin, as I said, is the tool you use to manage your database. I also can use command line tools, but because I'm using Windows, I just typically don't like working too much with the command line. So I use pgadmin. On Mac and Linux, it's a different story. I usually, like on Mac, I use a different application to manage my database, and I also use the command line. It's very easy. Linux, I mainly use the command line, but for Windows, I recommend pgadmin 4. So anyway, that's I've said my piece. So it's going to start up, and when you get presented with pgadmin, you're going to enter the password you chose for the default user Postgres you set up in the installation. So I'm going to type my password 1234 and hit enter. Again, only use a simple password if you have non-sensitive data on your computer. And anyway, so I'm going to zoom in here, and I have my browser on the left, servers, and these are all the servers I installed previously. So I'm going to just ignore these other ones. The one I've installed is Postgres 12. That's the one, that's the database I installed. So just take a look at this. And for this, I'm going to, again, type in the user for that database. So 1234, let me just save my password. And if I can connect to my database, it successfully expands this left part. Like that means my database is running, and my Postgres server is running. I don't have any databases set up yet. So that's one concept I want to explain, is that your server can be running, but you need to have different databases. A database is just a logical container for your data per application, right? So if I expand databases, I do have this default database called Postgres. And in many other, when we actually create our application, we'll create a separate database. So I keep my data nice and clean and separate. So this is just the default database, and you don't need to go into any of these yet. We don't have any tables set up yet, so I won't go into any of these or show you how to like what they all mean, because it's not necessary at the moment. So that's it. We've installed Postgres 12 in the moment, and we have the default database, and that's it for Windows. That's all you need to do. Okay, let's install Postgres 12 for Linux. This Linux distribution I have here is called Pop! OS. It's one of my favorite distributions for Linux. It's really easy to use, and it's based on the very popular Ubuntu Linux distribution. So I'm going to go to google.com and go to Postgres download. And oops, I misspelled it. And then I'm going to see here Linux. I can click this directly and head to the Linux download page. And because I'm using Ubuntu as the core distribution, please select any other distribution you're using based on what you're running. But if it's for Ubuntu, I'm going to click Ubuntu. And here's the thing. Let me zoom in for a sec. I want to install Postgres 12 again because I want to have a very specific version of Postgres, the same version I'm using on my servers when I finally deploy my application somewhere, so that I know what features I'm getting out of the database. So the latest version is version 12. That is kind of the most popular. They have version 13 out now, but I'm going to just install version 12 because I know that version very well. So I am going to follow these directions here and install it via apt. The one catch is I want to install a very specific version of Postgres. So when we get to this step, we're not going to say apt get install post-gres-Q-L. We're going to say post-gres-Q-L -12. So let me show you how to do that. I'm going to open a terminal window, and I'm just going to copy and paste in these commands. I'm going to copy this command, paste it in. And then I'm going to import the repository signing key, paste that in. And I'm going to say sudo apt-get update, run that. It's going to run. And then I'm going to say apt-get install post-gres-Q-L -12. So I'm typing in -12 here. So that's a very important step to take. I'm going to run that, and it's done. It's installed. But here's the thing. I want to make sure I have my password set for my default Postgres user. So when this installs on Linux, it sets up a user in your system called Postgres, and I'm going to kind of like run this command called psql, and that's going to give me a command prompt where I can work with my Postgres database and set my default password. So I'm going to type sudo SU, super user, Postgres. And that means I'm going to use my admin privileges to kind of change to the Postgres user. So now I'm the Postgres user, and the Postgres user can run the psql command and manage the database. So I'm going to run the psql command, and that psql command is giving me a Postgres shell. So this lets me see all my databases running that I've set up. The default database is just called Postgres. So if I type \dd, I see all the tables that I have set up. There are none right now. There's a lot of other commands you can do to show all types of information about the system, right? And I can also run specific queries against my default database. I won't do that right now. The core thing I need to do, though, is write \password. And that lets me set up a special password. So the new password for the default Postgres user in the database is going to be 1234. I just like to choose that because I don't have any very sensitive data in my database locally. There will be, when you set up the database on a server somewhere on the cloud, it's going to have a very cryptic password, and you're going to very securely protect that. But for now, that's fine. So I've set my password, and then I'm going to just write \Q to quit, and I'm back in my shell. And then I'm going to get back to my, I'm going to exit my session with the Postgres user. So I'm going to type exit and hit enter. And now I'm back to the normal user I use on my Linux system. So that's it. PostgreSQL is set up, and that's all I need to do. If I do want to create a database, that's going to be in another video. That's not really important at the moment, so don't worry about that. But note that there's a default database set up called Postgres, but there's no application-specific database, which is fine. So that's it for Linux. Okay, so let's finally install Postgres 12 on a Mac. So here I have google.com, and I'm just going to Google Postgres download. And here's the thing. On a Mac, you can install Postgres via the default website, post-gres-Q-L.org. But what I have is, if you scroll down, we have here postgresapp.com. And for some reason, you can't install this on the App Store, via the App Store. But if you go to postgresapp.com, I personally really like this app because it lets you switch between different versions of Postgres if you like, and it just gives you a nice, friendly user interface to work with Postgres. Basically, just the databases. There's another app I use to manage the database beyond the command line, and I can go over that later. But what I like to use is this app for installing Postgres. So since we're going to install version 12, which is the most popular version, pretty much 13 is available, but it's very, very new, and I just want to use the exact version I'm going to use in my backend application. Let's just install Postgres 12. So I hit the download here, and it's going to download the DMG file. Okay, so now that the DMG file is downloaded, I click this, it's going to open it. It's going to finish up here, and then I'm going to just drag it to the applications directory. It's going to copy it. Great. Now I can use it in my applications. I'm gonna find, I can type Postgres here by doing command space and just type Postgres, and you could see the app here, and I just hit enter. Or I can go to my applications directory and I can start it from there. So right now there's nothing here. There's no databases or anything like that. So I'm gonna click the initialize button. It's going to crunch away. I do have some old databases here that I used previously, but what you're going to see is the default database, which is called Postgres. And then there's a thing called server settings here. You can see where all your data is stored, the config file, all of that. And you're going to have a checkbox here. It says automatically start server. That's already checked for you. So you don't, every time you restart your computer, You don't have to click that. It's just going to start automatically. And then look, it says your server started, so you can stop it if you want, but it's started. And then lastly, up here, there's an icon that shows you that the server started. So you can always access this, your preferences and all that via this here. Okay, so the default database that's set up with the Postgres installation is called Postgres. And I need to set the password for that. I want to set the default password because when I edit my code, when I'm writing a backend application, I need to know all the connection parameters to connect to that database, also the database I'm using. So you're going to need to provide your username and password to connect to Postgres. So if we're going to use this Postgres user that's set up automatically, that's the default user, I need to set the password, and that's why I need to set the password. So I'm going to go to my, basically back to the website, and I have to enable the ability to use a special command line tool called PSQL to change this password. The app doesn't give me that option. So go down to the documentation tab on the website and jump down to CLI tools. And there's a command here that lets you configure your path environment variable so that every time you start up your command prompt, you can use this PSQL command. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to open my command prompt, and I'm going to paste this in, execute it. And every time I open my command prompt, I can now use this command. So what we want to do is we're going to say PSQL, that's the command prompt to manage your Postgres database, dash capital U, not a lowercase u, for being able to specify the user we want to connect with, and then space, and then Postgres. So this is the main user I want to connect to my database with, and that's the user I'm going to reset the password for. On Linux, we did a different command, and that's because the operating system, the installation sets up a Postgres actual user on Linux. But on macOS, we have to specify the user this way. Oops, I want to open up a new command prompt here so I can use this command. So Postgres. So PSQL, yeah, dash capital U space Postgres. Now I'm in the Postgres command. I can manage my database. I can run commands. And on the left here, it says what I'm connected to, what user I'm connected with. So I'm connected with the Postgres user. What I'm going to now type is / password. And that lets me set the password for that Postgres user. So I'm going to type in 1, 2, 3, 4, because I don't have any sensitive data in my database, nor will I locally. So I'm going to have a basic password for production or any other server apps where I'm having sensitive data stored. Maybe when I set up my cloud-based database, I'm going to have a much more secure password. But for locally, and because I'm not using a lot of sensitive data, I'm just going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, so it's easy to remember. So now to exit out, I'm going to do /q, and I've set up my database properly. Okay, so that's it. We've set up Postgres on Mac, Windows, and Linux, and we are going to be assuming that our application later is going to be using the default Postgres user to connect to the database. And we've lastly set the default password for that Postgres user, and we've set it to something very, very simple. So that's it. We're able to now write applications and connect to our Postgres database. And when we restart our computer or anything, that Postgres server should be automatically running. So thanks for watching.